Hi, I'm Nancy Wedman. I'm a retired physical therapist who worked with children. Multi-handicapped, primarily cerebral palsy, but many other disabilities. I knew from the time I was about 9 years old that I wanted to work with children. My brother was born when I was 9, and I was his chief babysitter and caretaker. I enjoyed children, and soon thereafter I began babysitting. And going through high school, I could have babysat every night of the week if I wanted. When I was 13, my sister and I went out in the country to pick up a dog that had been offered to us by some friends. And it was about 14 miles out in the country. And we drove out with no problem, picked up the puppy, and I was holding it in my lap in the front seat. And my sister was driving. She was just about ready to leave for college. And the pup got out of my lap and put his paws up on her knee, and she patted him, and the wheel caught the loose gravel at the shoulder of the road and startled her, and she lost control. We went through a ditch, through a fence, and the car rolled 6 times. I was thrown out the first time over, which turned out to be very fortunate. My sister was caught in the door on the 3rd time over, and the car rolled on top of her. And I had shook up and a little bit of a sprained ankle and a piece of glass through my arm, but otherwise was uninjured. My sister was in extreme damage, and the farmer and the neighbor, truck driver that came by, picked her up and carried her to the road and laid her in the back seat of a car. Miraculously, she did not have any spinal cord injury, and she survived at that point. They took us to the hospital, and 2 doctors spent 4 hours trying to piece her face together so there could be an open casket. And so they didn't expect her to live. They very briefly looked me over between times when they had to take a break from working on Shirley, and gave my dad a sedative to give me and had him take me home to go to bed. I wasn't allowed to see her for 2 weeks, and I was sure she had died, and my parents were keeping it from me. And I felt so responsible. Finally, after 2 weeks, when it appeared that she was going to survive, they sent her to Omaha, Nebraska, and they reattached her foot. Her right ankle had been broken completely, and all the ligaments and tendons torn loose. And they reattached it. She was put in a hip spica cast for about 3 months. At the end of that time, when they removed the cast, they gave her physical therapy and started her on that. Up until then, I hadn't known anything about physical therapy. Being from a small rural community, nothing like that was available in Imperial. So I became interested in physical therapy, and I was amazed at what it did for her. She was able to walk again, though at first with a cane, and has lived a very long, productive life. But at that point, I decided physical therapy was the way I wanted to work with children. So I attended Nebraska Wesleyan University. They had a pre-physical therapy program, which was set up for 4 years. I completed it in 3, and then was accepted at Mayo Clinic Physical Therapy School, and spent 2 years there. And it was a wonderful experience. I had the opportunity to see some very rare and unusual things, to treat a wide variety of patients, and I had made a lot of friends and kind of integrated into the community, and they offered me a contract to stay on staff. But at that point, they were not doing specialization, and I still wanted to specialize with children. Then I found a listing about the Crippled Children's School in Jamestown, North Dakota, which was a residential educational facility which offered therapy and medical care. And so I sent a letter out and asked if they had any openings. And I sent them a resume and listed two of the staff people that had trained me as references. And the next day, one of them came to me and said, "I didn't know you were thinking about going to Crippled Children's School." And I said, "Well, I didn't have a chance to call you, to see you, and I didn't think you'd hear from them so soon." He said that she had called them and talked with him. He said, "Do you know Dr. Ann?" And I said, "Well, only the name." And I assumed she was a medical doctor and knew nothing more. She called me and told me that they would pay for me to fly out for an interview and to stay overnight. So I took her up on it, and when I got to the airport and went into the terminal, I was amazed because here was a woman with no arms below the elbow, artificial legs, walking with underarm crutches with a leather strap across so she could keep them in place. And she walked me out to her car and with great ease got her crutches into the car, got seated, reached over and put her arm into the only prosthetic device I'd ever seen her use, which had a little clamp on it, and she used that to reach the ignition key into the ignition. And then she took it off and put it back in the door. And she drove me to the school, talking about what the school was like and how long it had been there and what the population was. And I was just in awe. We got to the school and went in, and they were having a screening program that they did every 2 years for the state of North Dakota, where they took in children who were not receiving services anywhere and worked with them in therapies, did psychological evaluations, and then the final week of the 4-week time, the parents were asked to come in and follow the kids through their therapies and activities and their meals. And then they met with the staff, and recommendations were made as to whether this facility would be appropriate or they should be placed in some other facility where they would be better served. And the atmosphere was so relaxed, and the school was so cheerful and bright, and laughter was everywhere. The kids were having a wonderful time, and I just fell in love with it. That evening, she took me out to supper with a friend who was back, who had been a former employee, and I sat there wondering, do I cut her meat? Do I pass the salt and pepper? Or, just totally unsure what to do. And she handled it like a pro. She brought her stumps together and flipped the fork under the food and whipped it up over into her mouth like it was the most natural thing in the world. And so the following morning, she had the young man who was visiting tour me through the city and show me all the sights and tell me what was available in town. And then she called around and located housing for me to go look at. So I rented a room and for the month of September. And I also got to go on a boat ride out at the dam. And the fundraiser, because it was supported by donations, fundraiser had taken the parents out for a ride before they went home. So he took me out for a ride on the boat through the dam. And I signed the contract, and I knew that was where I belonged. When school was out and I'd graduated, I came back here, and the students that were normally there were there. And at that time, the school year was the normal 9 months of a public school. And most of the children went home over the Christmas vacation. Other holidays they spent at the school. We had about 100 students. We had kindergarten through high school that was fully accredited, plus a 2-year business college. We had our own prosthetics and brace department. The business college students were, most of them were graduates of the high school there and just stayed on for the extra 2 years to get the business courses that they would need to work in an office. Many of them were post-polio, which was something which was not very common at that point in time. And the others were spinal cord injuries or cerebral palsy, but ones who had fairly normal speech patterns. And they were a lot of fun to work with. We had one young man who had been dropped out of high school as a freshman. His folks were divorced. He worked with his father in a lumber camp up in the mountains in Montana. And one evening, driving a load of lumber down from the camp, he hit an icy spot and wrecked and was thrown out of the vehicle and caught in a bush and laid in the snow in a bush overnight before they located him. He had mid-thoracic spinal cord injury, a tremendous amount of spasticity, and had real sensitive skin. And so he had gone through some rehab at the hospital there, and they told him he was never going to be able to use a wheelchair because every time he was put up in a wheelchair, he would get pressure sores. So they sold him a striker frame, which is a turning frame that people lay on when they've got a cord injury, and they can flip them over from front to back, but there's no pressure areas that way. And they told him that, so he came to school using that as his mode of transportation, and he wheeled it with short crutches, and he would go down the hall pulling 3 or 4 wheelchairs behind him. It was a riot. But he was a little hard on morale because he'd made up his mind that he was never going to get any better, and he wasn't going to let anybody get his hopes up. And we conducted a medical clinic with an orthopedist on a monthly basis. So when he was on the schedule, I introduced him, and the doctor asked him if he'd ever used a tilt table and brought up to standing. And he said, oh, no, I always got sick, nauseous. And so they didn't do that with me. And so he was very negative at the mention of any kind of orthotics or anything. And after I got him out of the room and started helping him get dressed again, he said, he believed me, didn't he? And I said, what? Were you lying? Well, I don't want to bother with braces. Well, we had another young man who was a quadriplegic from an accident. He was a Native American and had some treatment at Sister Kenny. And he was pretty independent. He could get in and out of his wheelchair alone. And they weren't dorm mates, but they were both in the same classes. And so he gave Rod a bad time about being a baby. And so Rod came in and said, Chuck told me I can use his knee lockers. Well, the knee lockers were just braces that fit just across the knees. And the quadriplegic was 6 foot tall, and we'd put the parallel bars up as high as they would go and put a platform in front of him so that he had something to rest his arms on. And he would stand for an hour a day just to keep his circulation and the bone strength. So I said, well, okay. So we put those on him and got him up. And he said, I want crutches. And I said, you can't walk with crutches on those. It's just not going to work for you. You have to have long braces that you can lock at the hips because your hips jackknife. So he said, well, what do I have to do to get braces? And I said, you have to be honest with the doctor and tell him, yes, you would like to have braces. So he got braces. And they, first day that we put them on, the gentleman that made the braces came into the department too. And it took both of us a half hour to get his spastic legs into the braces. got him up into the parallel bars, and he still wanted crutches. And I said, no, you're not ready for crutches. You have to learn to manage these in something stable. So I'd seen him one more time, and then I had a staff meeting during his therapy time. So I said, you don't come to therapy, I won't be there. I got out of the staff meeting and started past the front office, and she said, did you know your boy sprung wings? And I said, what? She said, he's outside on crutches. And I was flabbergasted.